In the underworld, beauty was a currency Elena Carter refused to spend. Knowing a pretty face was merely a target for predators, she traded her radiance for the shadows and perfected the art of staying unnoticed. For 3 years, Elena had been Adrian Kovalev's bookkeeper, threading through his blood-stained empire like smoke that balanced ledgers and brewed espresso. She wore boxy suits that drowned her silhouette, tortoiseshell frames that barricaded her face, and kept her auburn hair twisted back so tightly it could have been carved from stone. This afternoon felt different. The Montenegro arms deal documents lay fanned across Adrian's obsidian desk like blueprints for chaos, and Elena could sense something cracking open in her ribcage as she watched him scrutinize the numbers. His cold dark eyes moved over the figures with the precision of a sniper, and she wondered what it would be like to have that ferocity aimed at her instead of past her. "Cancel everything for next week," Adrian ordered without gracing her with a glance. "We're heading to Miami to seal the consortium arrangement in person." The word "we" struck Elena like a bullet she didn't see coming. In 3 years, Adrian had never pulled her beyond the armored walls of his New York headquarters. She clutched her leather portfolio tighter, feeling her heartbeat drum against her wrists. "I'll need someone to manage the paperwork and liaise with the estate security," he continued, his voice carrying that signature blend of control and menace. "Reserve 2 suites at the Vermillion Estate. We fly out Thursday." Elena's pen hesitated over her notepad. This was it. The opening she had been subconsciously holding her breath for without daring to admit it. A chance to step beyond the bulletproof glass cage she had welded around herself. Before we get back to Elena's brewing transformation and the moment she finally stops being invisible, hit that like and subscribe button and join our storytelling family. Where are you watching from? Tell us in the comments. We'd love to know how far our story reaches. Make sure to turn on notifications. You won't want to miss tomorrow's story. Now back to the story. "Understood, Mr. Kovalev," she responded. But something had shifted in her tone. A threat of steel that startled even her. As she returned to her corner desk, Elena glimpsed her reflection in the reinforced windows overlooking the Hudson. The woman staring back looked suffocated, entombed beneath layers of deliberate invisibility. But in her hazel eyes, something was finally clawing its way toward daylight. That night, alone in her rent-controlled Queens apartment, Elena stood before her bathroom mirror and began to dismantle the fortress she had constructed around herself. The punishing bun unraveled first, releasing cascades of copper-tinged waves that spilled past her shoulders. The barricade of frames came next, unveiling eyes that weren't merely hazel, but molten green shot through with gold. For the first time in years, Elena truly studied herself. Her complexion held a natural luminescence, her bone structure both delicate and defiant. When she allowed herself to smile, her entire expression shifted into something incandescent. 3 years of being furniture, she murmured to her reflection. She thought about Adrian's casual cruelty. The way he announced their trip without asking if she had commitments, without acknowledging she might exist beyond servicing his criminal enterprise. Every instance he had stared straight through her, spoken to her like she was voice-activated software rather than flesh and blood. Elena made a choice that would detonate everything. The weekend became her revolution. In a Soho salon, expert hands sculpted her appearance with precision cuts and dimensional color that made her hair catch sunlight like spun silk. A makeup artist revealed techniques to enhance what had always existed beneath her professional camouflage. Shopping felt like entering an alternate dimension. Instead of shapeless armor, Elena selected pieces that were elegant but impeccably tailored, garments that whispered power rather than screamed for attention. Elena Carter had mastered the mathematics of invisibility by her second month working for Adrian Kovalev. The equation was simple. The less he noticed her, the longer she'd keep breathing. She arrived at the Kovalev Syndicate headquarters each morning at precisely 6:45, a full hour before Adrian's armored SUV pulled into the private underground garage. Her desk occupied a shadowed corner of his vast office, close enough to hear every phone call, far enough to fade into the furniture. The position had been strategic when she accepted it. In Adrian's world, the women who caught his attention rarely lived long enough to regret it. Today unfolded like every other. Elena had already reconciled 3 offshore accounts, flagged 2 suspicious wire transfers from the Brighton Beach operation, and prepared Adrian's courtier to his exact specifications. Extra shot, no foam, served at precisely 160 degrees, before he strode through the door at 7:53. He didn't acknowledge her presence. He never did. Adrian moved through the room like a storm system, all coiled energy and barely restrained violence. His tailored charcoal suit couldn't quite civilize the predator underneath. The tattoos that crept above his collar, the scar that bisected his left eyebrow, the hands that had certainly ended lives. He settled behind his fortress of a desk and extended one palm without looking in her direction. Montenegro file, he stated. Elena placed the leather portfolio in his hand as she'd done 1,000 times before. Their fingers didn't touch. They never touched. The Volkov payment cleared, she reported, her voice deliberately flat, antiseptic. But the Belgrade account is showing irregular activity. Someone's skimming. Adrian's jaw tightened, the only indication he'd heard her. He flipped through the documents with the focus of a man reading a death warrant. Which Elena supposed he probably was. Deal with it, he said, still not meeting her eyes. Discreetly. Of course. She returned to her corner, to her prison of gray wool and thick frames, and began composing the carefully worded email that would result in someone losing far more than their job. This was her talent, her terrible gift. She could trace blood money through a dozen shell corporations, could read the story of violence in columns of numbers. She'd become fluent in the language of Adrian's empire, and he valued her the way someone values a particularly reliable appliance. The morning bled into afternoon. Adrian took 3 calls in Russian, 2 in Albanian, 1 in English so cold it could have flash-frozen the person on the other end. Elena transcribed, filed, archived. She was a phantom in sensible shoes, a ghost with impeccable spreadsheets. Coffee, Adrian commanded at 2:37, his eyes locked on his laptop screen. Elena rose without a word, prepared his second courtier with mechanical precision, and placed it on his desk. She'd learned to set it down at his right hand, exactly 4 inches from the keyboard, never in his sightline. She'd learned to be useful without being present. "You're still here?" he asked, though his tone suggested he was addressing the air itself rather than a human being. "Where else would I be, Mr. Kovalev?" Something flickered across his face. Annoyance, maybe, or confusion that his furniture had spoken. Then it vanished, replaced by the mask of absolute authority he wore like a second skin. "Get out. I need the room." Elena gathered her things and slipped toward the door, feeling the familiar ache of erasure settle in her chest. She paused at the threshold, allowing herself one glance back. Adrian was already absorbed in his screen, his world, his kingdom of shadows. He might as well have never existed at all. The summons came on a Wednesday that had started like any other exercise in invisibility. Elena was cross-referencing the latest shipment manifests from the Port Elizabeth operation when Adrian's voice cut through the sterile quiet of his office like a blade through silk. "Carter." She looked up from her laptop, careful to keep her expression neutral, forgettable. Adrian stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, his silhouette backlit by the harsh Manhattan skyline. He held his phone loosely in one hand, and something about his posture suggested a decision had already been made, one that would reshape her carefully constructed world whether she liked it or not. "The Miami Consortium meeting has been moved up," he said, turning to face her. His gaze swept over her with all the interest one might show a filing cabinet. "Stavros is getting impatient, and the Brazilians want guarantees before they commit their resources. We're handling this face-to-face." Elena's fingers stilled on her keyboard. "When?" "Thursday. We fly out at noon." He crossed to his desk, already scrolling through something on his phone. "The deal's worth $30 million in the first quarter alone, and I'm not having it collapse because someone couldn't read a room properly. You'll come along to manage the documentation and keep the financial details straight during negotiations." The words landed with the weight of an order, not a request. Elena had spent 3 years learning to decipher Adrian's commands, understanding that questions were rarely welcome and objections were never tolerated. "I'll make the arrangements," she said, reaching for her portfolio. Book us at the Vermillion Estate. 2 suites. I don't need you underfoot when I'm working. He finally glanced at her, and his expression carried that particular brand of dismissal she'd become intimately familiar with. And Carter? This isn't a vacation. The people we're meeting are the kind who notice details. Try not to look quite so. He paused, searching for the word, and Elena felt something cold crystallize in her chest. Forgettable, he finished, returning his attention to his phone. At least make an effort to seem like you belong in a room that costs $50,000 a night. I can't have my bookkeeper looking like she walked out of a funeral. The insult should have rolled off her like all the others. 3 years of similar dismissals had built up impressive scar tissue. But something about this one landed differently, sharper, in a place she'd thought she'd successfully numbed. Understood, Mr. Kovalev, Elena replied, and if her voice carried an edge, he didn't notice. He never noticed. We'll need the full financial projections, the revised territory agreements, and background files on everyone attending. I want to know what leverage we have before I walk into that room. He scrolled through his calendar with the casual efficiency of someone orchestrating chaos. Pack for 4 days. And Carter? Yes. Don't embarrass me. He said it without looking up, without malice, without anything at all. Just a flat statement of expectation. The last thing I need is questions about why I brought someone who looks like she's afraid of sunlight. Elena gathered her things with the mechanical precision of someone who'd learned to swallow rage like medicine. She stood, smoothed the shapeless lines of her gray suit, and headed for the door. I'll be ready, she said. Behind her, Adrian had already moved on to his next call, his next crisis, his next kingdom to conquer. She was dismissed, erased, already forgotten. But as Elena walked back to her corner desk, something unfamiliar sparked behind her ribs. Something dangerous and defiant that whispered a single reckless thought. What if I stopped trying to disappear? Elena stood in her cramped queen's bathroom that evening, staring at a stranger who'd been hiding in plain sight for 3 years. The woman in the mirror looked haunted. Erased. The severe bun pulled her features into something sharp and unforgiving, the thick frames obscuring eyes that had once been described as striking. Somewhere beneath the camouflage was the person she'd buried the day she accepted Adrian Kovalev's job offer. The Elena who'd graduated top of her forensic accounting class, who'd turned down legitimate firms because she'd been chasing something more dangerous than safety. Don't embarrass me. The words echoed in her skull like a verdict she hadn't realized she'd been waiting for. She reached up slowly, deliberately, and pulled the pins from her hair. The bun collapsed, releasing waves of auburn that tumbled past her shoulders. Longer than she'd remembered, shot through with copper highlights that caught the bathroom's harsh fluorescent light. Her hands moved to the tortoiseshell frames next, setting them on the counter with a finality that felt like breaking a contract. Without the armor, her reflection shifted into something that made her breath catch. High cheekbones. Full lips. Skin that held a natural warmth she'd forgotten existed. She'd spent 3 years building a fortress around herself, convinced that invisibility was survival. But Adrian's casual cruelty had cracked something open, and now Elena couldn't unsee what she'd sacrificed at the altar of safety. She made the call before she could second-guess herself. Valentina's, a smooth voice answered on the second ring. I need an appointment, Elena said. Tomorrow. Everything. There was a pause, the sound of clicking keys. I have a cancellation at 9. But darling, everything is a 4-hour commitment. Are you certain? Elena looked at her reflection, at the ghost she'd become, at the woman she used to be. Absolutely certain. Valentina's occupied the 3rd floor of a nondescript Soho building, the kind of place you'd walk past 1,000 times without noticing. But inside, it was a sanctuary of transformation, all exposed brick and strategic lighting, where women came to shed their skins and emerge as something closer to truth. Valentina herself was a striking woman in her 50s, with silver hair cropped close and the assessing gaze of someone who'd seen every kind of metamorphosis. You're hiding, she said simply, circling Elena like a sculptor evaluating marble. The question is, are we revealing or are we rebuilding? Revealing, Elena answered, surprised by the steadiness in her voice. Good. Rebuilding is dishonest. Revealing is revolution. The transformation unfolded like a ritual. Valentina's hands moved through Elena's hair with the precision of someone who understood that a cut could be an act of defiance. Layers emerged, framing her face, making the copper tones ignite under the salon lights. The colorist added dimension, subtle burgundy lowlights that made her hair look like spun silk catching fire. "You've been hiding something extraordinary," Valentina murmured, stepping back to assess her work. "Shame on whoever made you think you needed to." The makeup artist came next, a young woman named Sage who spoke in soft instructions about enhancing rather than concealing. She showed Elena how to bring out the gold flecks in her hazel eyes, how to define her bone structure without painting over it, how to choose colors that complemented rather than camouflaged. "You don't need armor," Sage said, tilting Elena's chin toward the light. "You just needed to remember you were never the enemy." The final touch was wardrobe. Not the shapeless suits that had been her uniform, but pieces that acknowledged her body existed. A tailored blazer in deep emerald that made her eyes luminous, silk blouses that moved like water, trousers that suggested curves without apologizing for them. When Valentina finally turned her toward the mirror, Elena barely recognized the woman staring back. She looked powerful, elegant, alive. "There you are," Valentina said softly. "Welcome back." Adrian Kovalev prided himself on control. He'd built an empire on the ability to read people, to anticipate moves 3 steps ahead, to never be caught off guard. Which made Thursday morning's experience at Teterboro Airport feel like a malfunction in reality itself. He was reviewing the consortium contracts on his tablet when he sensed movement near the hangar entrance. Muscle memory made him glance up. He'd survived this long by never ignoring his periphery, and that's when his brain short-circuited. A woman was walking toward his plane. Tall, graceful, wearing tailored charcoal trousers and an emerald silk blouse that caught the morning light. Her hair moved like liquid copper, framing a face that could have launched the kind of wars he typically profited from. She carried a leather portfolio with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what she was worth. Adrian's first thought was that one of Stavros's people had arrived early. His second was annoyance that someone had breached his security perimeter. His third thought derailed completely when the woman met his eyes and spoke. "Good morning, Mr. Kovalev. The pilots have filed the flight plan. We're cleared for departure." Elena. His bookkeeper. His invisible, forgettable, utterly dismissible bookkeeper. Adrian felt something fundamental shift in his chest, a sensation he couldn't quite categorize, which was perhaps more disturbing than the transformation itself. He'd built his reputation on never being unsettled, and yet here he was, staring at his assistant like she'd just materialized from another dimension. "Carter." The word came out sharper than he'd intended. "Is there a problem?" She tilted her head slightly, and the gesture contained something he'd never noticed before. A quiet challenge, barely perceptible but absolutely present. "No. Get on the plane." He turned back to his tablet with more force than necessary, annoyed at himself for the reaction, more annoyed that he couldn't seem to control it. The Gulfstream's cabin was configured for business. Cream leather seats, polished mahogany surfaces, enough space for 8 but currently occupied by just the 2 of them. Adrian had deliberately chosen the forward-facing seat on the starboard side, his customary position. It offered optimal sightlines and put his back to solid aircraft structure. Elena settled across from him, crossing her legs with an elegance that made him acutely aware he was noticing details he had no business noticing. She opened her laptop with the same efficiency she'd always displayed, but something about her movements had changed. There was a fluidity there, a self-possession that made the air in the cabin feel charged. He tried to focus on the contracts. Tried to review the background files on the Brazilian delegation. Tried to do anything except look at the woman who'd somehow become the most compelling thing in his field of vision. It was impossible. His eyes kept drifting toward her, the way the light caught in her hair, the concentration on her face as she worked, the curve of her neck when she tilted her head to read something on her screen. He'd sat across from Elena Carter hundreds of times over 3 years and never once registered her as anything beyond functional. Now he couldn't seem to think about anything else. "The projected revenue streams are looking solid," Elena said without looking up, her voice carrying that same professional neutrality she'd always maintained. "But the territory divisions are going to be the sticking point. Stavros won't concede the port access without significant compensation." Adrian grunted acknowledgement, hating that even her voice sounded different now. Or maybe it had always sounded like that, low and smooth as expensive whiskey, and he'd simply never bothered to listen. What the hell had she done to herself? And more importantly, why did it feel like she'd somehow gained the upper hand without either of them acknowledging the shift? "You're staring, Mr. Kovalev," Elena said, finally meeting his gaze. There was something in her eyes, amusement maybe or satisfaction, that made his jaw tighten. "I'm observing," he corrected, his voice dropping into the dangerous register he used when establishing dominance. "There's a difference." "Of course." She returned to her laptop, and Adrian could have sworn he saw the ghost of a smile play at the corner of her mouth. The plane leveled out at cruising altitude, and Adrian realized with growing irritation that the next 3 hours were going to be an exercise in torture. Not because of the woman across from him, but because of his own inexplicable inability to look away. He'd spent 3 years not seeing Elena Carter. Now apparently he couldn't see anything else. The Vermillion Estate sprawled across 3 acres of Miami beachfront like a monument to excess. Adrian had disappeared into meetings the moment they'd arrived, leaving Elena to settle into her suite, a palatial space of marble and glass that probably cost more per night than her monthly rent. She'd spent the afternoon reviewing contracts and coordinating logistics, falling back into the familiar rhythm of work. But when the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, everything changed. The consortium gala was scheduled for 7. An informal poolside gathering, Adrian's assistant had said over email. Elena knew better than to trust the word informal when $30 million hung in the balance. She stood before the full-length mirror in her suite, studying her reflection with the clinical assessment of someone preparing for battle. The woman staring back bore no resemblance to the ghost who'd haunted Adrian's office for 3 years. The swimsuit was midnight blue, cut with architectural precision that suggested elegance rather than exhibition. Over it she draped a sheer wrap in complementary silver that caught light like moonlight on water. Her hair fell in loose waves past her shoulders, and the Miami humidity had given it a texture that looked effortless, expensive. Minimal jewelry, just thin gold hoops and a delicate chain at her collarbone. She looked like someone who belonged in Adrian Kovalev's world. Not as furniture but as an equal. Elena slipped into heeled sandals and made her way down to the pool terrace, her pulse thrumming with something between anticipation and reckless defiance. The terrace had been transformed into something from a fever dream, strings of Edison bulbs crisscrossing overhead, the infinity pool glowing in ethereal blue, Miami's skyline providing a glittering backdrop. Well-dressed predators clustered in small groups, champagne flutes in hand, discussing territory and violence with the casual ease of people ordering brunch. Elena spotted Adrian immediately. He stood near the far end of the pool, deep in conversation with 2 men she recognized from their files, Stavros Demetrio and Carlos Mendez, the Greek and Brazilian power brokers who controlled enough of the eastern seaboard to make kingdoms jealous. Adrian wore linen trousers and a white button-down with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, his tattoos on full display. He looked dangerous and magnetic, exactly the kind of man mothers warned their daughters about. She took a breath and stepped into the light. The effect was immediate and seismic. Conversations stuttered. Heads turned. A dark-haired woman in a crimson dress actually stopped mid-sentence to stare. But Elena only cared about one reaction. Adrian's gaze found her across the terrace, and for the first time in 3 years, she watched his carefully constructed mask of indifference completely shatter. His expression cycled through shock, recognition, and something far more primitive, something that looked dangerously close to hunger. The water glass in his hand tilted slightly, forgotten, as his entire body oriented toward her like a compass finding true north. Stavros said something, but Adrian didn't respond. Didn't even seem to hear. He just stared, his jaw tight, his dark eyes tracking her movement with the intensity of a predator who'd just spotted prey that had inexplicably transformed into competition. Elena crossed the terrace with deliberate grace, acutely aware of every eye following her trajectory. She'd spent 3 years making herself small, forgettable, safe. Tonight she was claiming space like it had always belonged to her. "Gentlemen," she said smoothly as she reached Adrian's group, extending her hand to Stavros first. "Elena Carter. Mr. Kovalev's financial strategist." Stavros took her hand with obvious appreciation, his smile widening. "Stavros Dimitriou. Though I suspect you already knew that." His Greek accent wrapped around the words like velvet. "Adrian, you didn't mention you were traveling with such captivating company." Adrian's silence stretched several beats too long. When he finally spoke, his voice carried an edge that could have drawn blood. "Ms. Carter handles the documentation." The words came out clipped, territorial. "Nothing more." "How fascinating," Stavros murmured, his gaze lingering on Elena with unmistakable interest. "I've always found that the most brilliant minds are often the most overlooked." Elena met Adrian's eyes and watched something volatile flash across his features. Possessiveness, confusion, and beneath it all, the dawning recognition that the rules of engagement had fundamentally changed. "Shall we discuss the port access agreements?" she asked, her tone professional but carrying an undertone that suggested she knew exactly what she'd just detonated. Adrian's expression promised consequences. But for the first time in 3 years, Elena wasn't afraid of them. Stavros Dimitriou was the kind of dangerous that came wrapped in charm and expensive cologne. He'd maneuvered himself next to Elena within minutes of the introductions, positioning himself with the calculated precision of someone who understood exactly how power dynamics shifted at gatherings like these. His linen suit probably cost more than a compact car, and his smile suggested he was accustomed to getting whatever he wanted. "So tell me, Elena," he said, her name rolling off his tongue with practiced ease. "How does someone with your evident capabilities end up managing paperwork for Adrian?" The question was designed to flatter and undermine simultaneously, a technique Elena recognized from 3 years of watching men play chess with human lives. "I find numbers more honest than people," she replied, accepting a champagne flute from a passing server. "They don't lie about their intentions." Stavros laughed, genuine delight lighting his features. "Brilliant and refreshingly direct. Adrian, you've been holding out on us." Adrian stood 3 feet away, ostensibly engaged in conversation with Carlos about shipping routes, but Elena could feel his attention like a physical weight. Every muscle in his body had gone taut, coiled with barely restrained tension that made the air around him feel combustible. "Miss Carter's employment isn't up for discussion," Adrian said, his voice carrying that particular tone of absolute authority that usually ended conversations. Stavros either didn't notice or didn't care. He shifted slightly closer to Elena, close enough that she caught the scent of his cologne, something dark and woody that probably cost obscene amounts of money. "I'm expanding my operations into the Balkans," he continued, his attention fixed on Elena with uncomfortable intensity. "I could use someone with forensic accounting expertise. Someone who understands the nuances of international finance." He paused, letting the offer hang in the charged air. The compensation would be extraordinary. It was a power move disguised as professional courtesy. Stavros wasn't actually trying to recruit Elena. He was testing Adrian, probing for weakness, seeing how far he could push before something snapped. Elena understood the game immediately. The question was whether she wanted to play along or defuse it. Before she could respond, Adrian moved. Not obviously, not dramatically, but with the lethal efficiency of someone who'd spent a lifetime establishing dominance. He closed the distance between them in 2 strides, positioning himself so that his body created a barrier between Elena and Stavros, a territorial claim that needed no verbal announcement. "Stavros," Adrian said, his voice dropping into a register that made several nearby conversations falter. "We should discuss the distribution percentages. Privately." It wasn't a suggestion. Stavros raised his hands in mock surrender, but his smile never wavered. Of course. Though I hope you'll allow me to continue our conversation later, Elena. I find your perspective refreshing. He drifted away with Carlos, leaving Elena alone with Adrian in a pocket of charged silence that felt dangerous enough to ignite. Adrian didn't speak immediately. He stood there, his jaw working, his dark eyes fixed on some point beyond the terrace. When he finally turned to face her, the expression on his face made Elena's pulse spike. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" The words came out quiet, controlled, which somehow made them more threatening than if he'd shouted. "Having a conversation," Elena replied, keeping her voice level despite the adrenaline flooding her system. "Isn't that what people do at social gatherings?" "Don't." Adrian stepped closer, invading her space with the casual confidence of someone who'd never been told no. "Don't play games you don't understand." Elena held her ground, tilting her chin up to meet his gaze. This close, she could see the flecks of amber in his dark eyes, could feel the heat radiating from his body, could smell the cedar and smoke scent that she'd become intimately familiar with over 3 years of proximity. "I understand perfectly," she said softly. "The question is, do you?" Something flickered across Adrian's features. Confusion, anger, and beneath it all, something that looked dangerously close to desperation. "You're my employee," he said, but the words lacked their usual conviction. "Then treat me like one." Elena took a deliberate step back, creating distance, reclaiming control. "Or admit that something's changed." She walked away before he could respond, feeling his gaze burning into her back like a brand. Across the terrace, Stavros watched the exchange with obvious interest, his expression suggesting he'd just witnessed something far more valuable than any business negotiation. The game had shifted. And Elena had just made the opening move. Elena made it back to her suite just past midnight, her feet aching from the heeled sandals and her mind still buzzing from 3 hours of navigating conversations that felt like walking through a minefield in evening wear. She'd barely kicked off her shoes when someone knocked, 3 sharp raps that carried unmistakable authority. She knew who it was before she opened the door. Adrian stood in the hallway, still wearing his linen trousers but having lost the button down somewhere along the way. A plain black t-shirt stretched across his chest, making the tattoos on his arms stand out in sharp relief against his skin. His hair was disheveled like he'd been running his hands through it, and his expression held a wildness she'd never seen before, something uncontrolled and dangerous. "We need to talk," he said, not waiting for an invitation before stepping past her into the suite. Elena closed the door slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs. "It's midnight, Mr. Kovalev. Don't." He whirled to face her, and the composure he wore like armor had completely shattered. "Don't Mr. Kovalev to me right now. Not after the performance you put on down there." "Performance?" Elena crossed her arms, feeling her own temper spark. "I attended a business function. I made professional conversation. Exactly what you brought me here to do." "Professional." Adrian laughed, but there was no humor in it, just raw, frustrated energy that filled the room like static before a lightning strike. "You call what happened with Stavros professional? He offered me a job. That's fairly standard networking behavior. He was undressing you with his eyes." Adrian's voice dropped to something gravelly and possessive. "And you let him?" Elena felt her spine straighten, felt 3 years of swallowed insults and casual dismissals crystallize into something sharp and unforgiving. "I let him? That's interesting coming from a man who spent 3 years treating me like office equipment." "That's not," Adrian broke off, dragging a hand through his hair. He looked like a man coming apart at the seams, and some vindictive part of Elena found satisfaction in watching his control fracture. "This isn't about the past 3 years. Then what is it about?" Elena demanded, taking a step toward him. "Because from where I'm standing you're angry that someone finally noticed I exist. That someone looked at me like I was worth looking at." "Of course you're worth." Adrian stopped abruptly as if the admission had escaped without permission. His jaw clenched, tendons standing out in sharp relief. "You're not taking his job." "Excuse me." "You heard me." He moved closer, eliminating the space between them with predatory grace. "You're not working for Stavros. You're not working for anyone else. You work for me. Elena tilted her head back to maintain eye contact, refusing to be intimidated even though her pulse was racing. That's not your decision to make. The hell it isn't. Adrian's hands clenched into fists at his sides, like he was physically restraining himself from reaching for her. Do you have any idea what kind of man Stavros is? What he does to people, to women, who catch his interest? I imagine he's quite similar to you, Mr. Kovalev. The words landed like a slap. Adrian flinched, something that might have been pain flickering across his features before it hardened into anger. I would never. He stopped, breathing hard. You don't know what you're talking about. Then enlighten me. Elena held her ground even as Adrian invaded her space, close enough now that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. Tell me why you're in my suite at midnight acting like a man who has some kind of claim on me. Tell me why it matters who looks at me, who talks to me, who offers me opportunities you never bothered to acknowledge I deserved. Because, Adrian's voice broke on the word. His dark eyes searched her face with desperate intensity, and Elena watched years of carefully constructed walls crumble in real time. Because I can't stand the thought of him touching you. Of anyone touching you. Of losing. He stopped himself, but the confession hung between them like a live wire. Losing what? Elena whispered. Your bookkeeper. Your invisible assistant. You. The word came out raw, stripped of all pretense. I can't stand the thought of losing you. The silence that followed felt like standing on the edge of a precipice. You never had me, Elena said quietly, and watched Adrian's expression shatter completely. Adrian looked like he'd been struck. He stood frozen in the middle of her suite, his chest rising and falling with harsh breaths, every carefully constructed defense stripped away to reveal something raw and wounded underneath. What do you mean I never had you? His voice came out hoarse, almost fragile. A tone Elena had never heard from a man who'd built an empire on being unbreakable. Exactly what I said. Elena kept her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. You had an employee. A useful appliance that made your coffee and balanced your blood money. But me, the actual person, you never bothered to look. That's not true. Isn't it? Elena felt 3 years of buried frustration rising like a tide. Tell me one thing about me, Adrian. One personal detail. My favorite color. Where I grew up. What I do when I'm not managing your criminal enterprise. Anything. Adrian opened his mouth, then closed it. The silence stretched between them like an accusation. You can't, Elena said, and the satisfaction of being right tasted bitter. Because to you I didn't exist beyond my function. I was furniture that happened to have excellent spreadsheet skills. I was protecting you. The words burst out of Adrian like a confession under interrogation. Do you understand what happens to women in my world? To anyone I show the slightest interest in? They become targets. Leverage. Casualties. So you made me invisible instead. Elena laughed, but there was no humor in it. How noble. How convenient that your protection looked exactly like indifference. Adrian flinched. It wasn't indifference. Then what was it? Elena demanded, taking a step toward him. Because those insults, the casual cruelty, the way you looked through me like I was glass, that felt pretty damn indifferent. It was survival. Adrian's composure finally cracked completely, his voice rising. Mine and yours. Because if I let myself see you, really see you, I would have lost my mind 3 years ago. The admission hung in the air between them, electric and dangerous. Elena stared at him, trying to reconcile this man, desperate, unraveled, achingly honest, with the cold predator who'd spent 3 years treating her like she was barely worth noticing. You're telling me, she said slowly, that you deliberately made me feel worthless because you were attracted to me? Not attracted. Adrian dragged both hands through his hair, looking like a man at the end of his rope. Obsessed. From the first week you walked into my office with those financial projections and called out my money laundering scheme like you were ordering coffee. You were brilliant and fearless, and I knew, that if I let myself want you it would destroy everything. So you destroyed me instead. No. God, no. Adrian closed the distance between them, stopping just short of touching her. I was blind and stupid. I convinced myself that if I didn't acknowledge what you were, what you are, then maybe I could keep you safe. Keep myself under control. But all I did was waste 3 years being a coward. Elena felt her anger warring with something more complicated. Something that wanted to believe him, to trust that this vulnerability was real and not just another manipulation. I don't believe you, she said even as her voice wavered. This only started when I changed my appearance. When I stopped being forgettable. You didn't see me until I looked like this. That's where you're wrong. Adrian's voice dropped to something painfully honest. I've seen you every single day for 3 years. I knew exactly how you took your tea. How you bit your lower lip when you were concentrating. The way you tucked your hair behind your left ear when you were nervous. I noticed everything, Elena. I just pretended I didn't because the alternative was terrifying. Elena's breath caught. You're lying. Your favorite pen is the Pilot G2 in blue size 7. You organize files alphabetically but color code them by priority. You hum when you think no one's listening, classical pieces, usually Debussy. And you have a scar on your right wrist from a childhood accident you've never mentioned but I noticed anyway. The specificity of it stole the air from Elena's lungs. So no, Adrian continued, his dark eyes burning into hers. This isn't about how you look tonight, though you look devastating. This is about the fact that I can't pretend anymore. I can't watch other men see what I've been too afraid to claim. Claim. Elena's voice turned sharp. I'm not property. That's not what I meant. Then what do you want, Adrian? Elena challenged. The bookkeeper who keeps your secrets? Or the woman who just spent 3 years becoming invisible to survive your world? Adrian was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. I want Elena. All of her. Everything I've been too terrified to reach for. Elena wanted to believe him. God, how desperately she wanted to believe that the vulnerability in Adrian's voice was real. That 3 years of dismissal could be rewritten as something resembling protection. But trust wasn't something that came easily when you'd spent 1,000 days learning to disappear. Words are easy, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. You've built an empire on saying what people need to hear. Adrian's expression shifted. Not anger but something closer to resignation, like he'd anticipated this exact objection and prepared for it. You're right. Words are currency in my world. Which is why I'm going to show you instead. He pulled out his phone, fingers moving across the screen with purpose. Bye, sweet. 5 minutes. There's something you need to see. Adrian. Please. The words sounded foreign in his mouth, like a language he rarely spoke. Just 5 minutes. And if you still think I'm lying after that, I'll accept it. I'll back off. You can take Stavros's offer or anyone else's and I won't say another word. Elena studied his face, looking for deception and finding only exhausted honesty. 5 minutes. Adrian's suite was twice the size of hers. All dark wood and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the ocean. He led her past the main sitting area to a mahogany desk positioned near the window, its surface dominated by his laptop and a single leather-bound notebook. He picked up the notebook and Elena noticed his hands weren't quite steady. 3 years ago you left me a note, Adrian said quietly. It was your second week. I'd been in meetings all day and you'd noticed I hadn't eaten. You ordered food to my office with a post-it that said, "Tyrants function better on a full stomach." Elena remembered. She'd been terrified he'd find it presumptuous, fire her on the spot. I kept it, Adrian continued. He opened the notebook and Elena's breath caught. Pages and pages of small notes, posts, torn corners of legal pads, every casual communication she'd ever left him, carefully preserved and chronologically arranged. Her handwriting stared back at her from dozens of small squares of paper, mundane reminders transformed into something precious by the simple act of keeping them. Meeting with the Volkov delegation moved to 3 p.m. Your dry cleaning is in the closet. They fixed the button. Bad news on the Belgrade account. Details on your desk. You missed lunch again. There's a sandwich in your drawer. Adrian turned the pages slowly, reverently, revealing months and then years of tiny interactions that Elena had assumed meant nothing. I told myself I was keeping them for record-keeping purposes, he said, his voice rough. But that was a lie. I kept them because they were yours. Because every note proved you existed, that you were thinking about me even in small ways. Because on the worst days, the days when the violence got too close, when I questioned every choice that led me here, I could open this and remember there was at least one person in my world who gave a damn if I ate lunch. Elena felt tears burning behind her eyes. Why didn't you say something? Because I'm a coward. Adrian set the notebook down like it was something sacred. Because men like me don't get to have something good without destroying it. I've spent 3 years convincing myself that keeping you at a distance was noble, that my indifference was protection. But the truth. He laughed bitterly. The truth is I was terrified that if I let myself love you, I'd ruin you the way I ruin everything I touch. Love, Elena whispered. Yes. Adrian met her eyes and the naked vulnerability there nearly broke her. I've been in love with you since you corrected my math on a money laundering scheme and called me impressively sloppy to my face. I've been in love with you through every terrible coffee order, every late night, every moment you existed in my space and made it feel less like a prison. And I've been absolutely terrified of it for just as long. Elena reached for the notebook with trembling hands, flipping through pages of her own forgotten words. Evidence of 3 years of small kindnesses, mundane care, the quiet intimacy of daily existence. You're right that I didn't see you clearly until tonight, Adrian continued. But not because you weren't beautiful before. Because I'd worked so hard to convince myself you were off limits that I built a fortress around the truth. Tonight you burned that fortress down and I can't unsee what was always there. Elena looked up from the notebook, tears finally spilling over. You made me feel worthless. I know. Adrian's voice cracked. And I will spend however long it takes making that right if you let me. I can't promise I won't be possessive or overprotective or occasionally terrifying. I can't promise that my world won't be dangerous or that loving me will be easy. But I can promise that I see you, Elena, all of you. And I'm done pretending I don't. The sun was beginning to rise over Miami, painting the ocean in shades of rose and gold. Elena stood in the growing light, holding a notebook full of evidence that she'd mattered all along, looking at a man who'd spent 3 years loving her from behind a wall of his own construction. I want you to prove it, she said finally. Not with words or grand gestures. But every day. In the small moments. The way I proved I cared about you for 3 years without even realizing what I was doing. Adrian's expression transformed, hope breaking through desperation like dawn. I can do that. And Adrian? Elena stepped closer, close enough to feel his breath, to see her reflection in his dark eyes. The next time you insult my appearance, I'm taking Stavros's offer and liquidating your offshore accounts on my way out. He laughed. A real genuine sound that made him look years younger. Noted. When he kissed her, it felt like 3 years of held breath finally released, like coming home to a place she hadn't known she'd been searching for. His hands cradled her face with a gentleness that contradicted everything she knew about Adrian Kovalev, and she tasted desperation and promise and the kind of surrender that only came when you stopped fighting what you'd always wanted. For the record, Elena murmured against his mouth, Debussy's Clair de Lune. That's what I hum. I know, Adrian whispered back. I've always known. Elena Carter spent 3 years in the shadows, but tonight she became the only woman a Mafia king couldn't look away from. She traded her sensible shoes for a revolution, proving that the most dangerous person in the room is the one everyone overlooked. But in Adrian Kovalev's world, stepping into the light means every predator can finally see you, including the one holding the ledger. If this journey of defiance and hidden obsession has you on the edge of your seat, don't let the fire go out here. Claim your seat in the family. Hit that subscribe button now and join our growing community of story lovers. Tell us in the comments, was Adrian truly protecting her for 3 years, or was he just a coward afraid of his own heart? Make sure the notification bell is on so you're the first to see tomorrow's high-stakes release. Thank you for watching. Remember, in this world, love is the most expensive secret of all. We'll see you in tomorrow's story.